The wind was a blade, sharp enough to shave the soul from a man. It screamed across the ice-locked plains of Arctic Station Hyperion, a sound of pure, elemental fury that seeped through the triple-glazed plasteel of the barracks. Every gust was a reminder of the Admiral's first and only commandment: the storm is the enemy, and order is our shield. Order was everything. It was the precise hum of the geothermal generators, the rigid patrol schedules, the unwavering adherence to protocol that kept 300 souls from being devoured by the white, howling nothingness outside. I was Sergeant Eva Rostova, a cog in that machine of order, and my world was a 24-hour cycle of duty, exhaustion, and the gnawing cold that even the station's heating couldn't fully repel. My post was the Western Watchtower, a lonely perch overlooking the frozen sea. For 72 hours, the polar vortex had clamped its teeth down on us, and visibility was a cruel joke. The world beyond the glass was a maelstrom of white, a living, breathing entity of chaos. Protocol was absolute. No one ventured outside. No exceptions. To open a single airlock was to invite the killer in, to risk a catastrophic pressure drop that could compromise the entire sector. The Admiral's voice, a baritone scraped from rock and ice, had been clear in the station-wide broadcast. Discipline will be our salvation or our tomb. There is no middle ground. Break ranks, and you sentence us all. His words were law, as cold and unyielding as the permafrost beneath our feet. My sister, Lena, was the reason I was here, serving out a 4-year contract in this frozen hell. Her medical bills were a mountain I could only climb one miserable, Arctic day at a time. She was my vulnerable loved one, the soft, warm place in the desolate landscape of my life. Thinking of her was my only comfort, a flickering candle against the hurricane. It was on the third night of the storm, during the hour of the wolf when the station was at its quietest, that I saw it. A flicker of movement on the exterior camera feed, a ghost in the machine of swirling snow. I blinked, rubbing the grit from my eyes. It was probably nothing, a glitch, a shadow playing tricks. But then it came again, clearer this time. A small, dark shape, battling the wind, stumbling near the perimeter of the comms array. My blood went cold. I zoomed the camera, my heart hammering against my ribs. The resolution was poor, distorted by the blizzard, but there was no mistaking the shape. It was a child. Small, bundled in a red snowsuit, a beacon of impossible color in the monochrome fury. My breath hitched. It was Leo, the 7-year-old son of Dr. Aries Thorne, the station's lead xenobotanist. A quiet, wide-eyed boy who loved the stories of old Earth explorers. What in God's name was he doing out there? A frantic check of the station logs gave me the answer. Dr. Thorne had been medevaced 2 days before the storm hit, a ruptured appendix. His son, due to the suddenness of it all, had been left in the care of a civilian contractor. A contractor who, I now saw with a sickening lurch in my stomach, had signed out for a sedative from the infirmary 3 hours ago. He was likely passed out, oblivious. The boy was alone. And he was outside. I hailed the command deck, my voice tight. Watchtower West to command. I have a visual on the exterior perimeter, Sector Gamma. I believe it is a child. The response was clipped, dismissive. Lieutenant Rask, a man whose spine was forged from military regulations. Negative, Watchtower. All personnel are accounted for. It's a sensor ghost. The storm is playing hell with the systems, sir. With respect, I pushed, my voice rising. I have a clear visual. It's the Thorne boy. He's in a red snowsuit. He's fallen near the primary array. A pause. I could almost hear Rask sneer. Sergeant, your post is to observe and report, not to hallucinate. Maintain your watch. Command out. The line went dead. I stared at the screen, at the small red that was a child's life, flickering like a dying ember. The wind howled, a predator's cry. In my mind, I saw the Admiral's face, his eyes like chips of granite, his voice echoing the gospel of order. Break ranks, and you sentence us all. But then I saw Lena's face, her smile weak but full of fight. I saw the fierce, protective love I felt for her, a fire that no Arctic wind could extinguish. And I saw that small boy, swallowed by the vast, indifferent white. My moral compass, the one my mother had given me, spun wildly, then pointed to its own true north. It didn't point to order. It pointed to Leo. I stood up, my movements stiff with a terrible, clarifying certainty. My loyalty was to life, not to a protocol that would sanction the death of a child. I was a resilient underdog, a woman forged in the fires of financial hardship and familial duty, and I would not let a boy die because of a ghost in the machine. "This is Sergeant Eva Rostova," I spoke into the comms, my voice ringing with a defiance that terrified me. "I am breaking protocol. I am proceeding to airlock Gamma 7 to retrieve a civilian child. This is a declaration." I didn't wait for a response. I ripped my headset off, the squawk of Rask's furious voice cut short. My transformation from a cog to an agent of change had begun. I grabbed the emergency thermal gear, my hands shaking but my purpose absolute. I was just a sergeant. He was the Admiral. I never thought I'd confront him, never thought my name would even cross his lips. But as I keyed the override sequence for the airlock, stepping into the violent embrace of the storm, I knew I had just declared war on his world. The airlock door hissed shut behind me, a final, metallic sigh sealing my fate. The storm hit me not as wind, but as a solid wall. It was a physical assault, a battering ram of ice and fury that stole the air from my lungs and tried to rip the flesh from my bones. The noise was deafening, a constant, high-pitched shriek that vibrated through my skull, erasing all thought. This was the enemy the Admiral spoke of, but it was no metaphor. It was a tangible beast, a predator of unimaginable power, and I had just stepped willingly into its jaws. My thermal suit was military-grade, the best on the station, but the cold was a living thing, seeping through the layers with insidious patience, searching for purchase on my skin. The helmet's heads-up display flickered, my vitals spiking erratically. Visibility was less than a meter. The world wasn't white, it was a swirling, vertigo-inducing grey, a disorienting void where up and down had no meaning. I had one anchor, the guideline. A high-tensile cable that ran the length of the station's exterior, a lifeline for emergency repairs. I clipped my harness to it, the magnetic carabiner locking with a solid thunk that was the only reassuring sound in this chaos. My objective was Sector Gamma, the communications array. According to my last visual, Leo was somewhere near its base. It was a 200-meter journey that might as well have been a kilometer. I moved hand over hand, my body bent double against the gale, each step a monumental effort. The wind was a cat-and-mouse player, toying with me. It would lull for a terrifying second, creating a pocket of near silence, before slamming into me from a new direction, trying to tear my grip from the line. Ice crystals, as sharp as glass shards, sandblasted my helmet's visor, and I had to continually wipe it with a gloved hand that was rapidly losing feeling. Doubt, cold and sharp as the ice, began to creep in. Rask's voice echoed in my head. "It's a sensor ghost. What if he was right? What if I was out here, a fool on a suicide mission, chasing a phantom while the real threat was the storm I had invited into my own lungs?" I faltered, my boots slipping on a patch of slick ice. I slammed against the station wall, the impact jarring my teeth. For a moment, I just hung there, suspended from the line, the shrieking wind my only companion. The temptation to turn back, to retreat to the warmth and relative safety of the airlock, was a siren song. But then the image of the small red bundle flashed in my mind. It wasn't a ghost. It was a child. My fierce, protective instinct, the one honed by years of shielding Lena from the world's harsh realities, roared back to life. I pushed off the wall and continued, my movements fueled now by a defiant rage. I was no longer just fighting the storm, I was fighting the cold, sterile logic that would leave a child to die. The comms array loomed out of the grey chaos like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Its massive dish, coated in a thick layer of rime ice, moaned as the wind tore at it. I unclipped from the main guideline and attached to the array's local safety line, beginning a spiral search around its base. "Leo." My voice was swallowed by the gale, the word stolen from my lips the moment it was uttered. The helmet's external speaker was useless in this din. I swept the beam of my shoulder-mounted lamp across the snowdrifts piling up against the structure. The light cut a pathetic swathe through the darkness, revealing nothing but dancing curtains of snow. Panic began its cold ascent up my spine. Had I been too late? Had the storm already taken him, burying him beneath the ever-growing drifts. I fought down the despair, forcing myself into a methodical grid search, my light tracing patterns in the snow. And then I saw it. A flash of red. Not a ghost, not a glitch. It was a small, woolen mitten, half buried in the snow. My heart leaped. I scrambled towards it, falling to my knees, digging frantically with my clumsy gloves. Beneath the mitten was a small hand, pale and terrifyingly still. I dug faster, my breath coming in ragged bursts, my own body's heat turning the snow to slush against my suit. I uncovered him slowly, a small, still form curled into a fetal position. Leo. His face was waxen, tinged with blue, his eyelashes frosted with ice. I pressed my glove to his neck, praying for a pulse. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then, I felt it. A flutter. Faint, thready, but there. He was alive. The relief that washed over me was so profound it almost brought me to my knees. But this was no time for emotion. The rising stakes were clear, he was in the grip of severe hypothermia. Every second I wasted out here was a second he slipped further away. I gathered him into my arms. He was unnervingly light. I activated the emergency beacon on my suit, a desperate, silent scream for help I knew protocol would ignore. The journey back was a new kind of hell. I now had the precious, fragile weight of the boy in my arms, making it impossible to use both hands on the guideline. I had to brace him against my chest with one arm, using the other to slide my carabiner along the cable. The wind seemed to sense my vulnerability, redoubling its assault. It tried to use the boy's small body as a sail, to tear him from my grasp. I shielded him with my own body, turning my back to the worst of the gusts, taking the brunt of the ice shard spray on my own suit. My muscles screamed in protest, my core temperature alarm began to flash a pale blue warning on my HUD. I was a victim of circumstance turning into an agent of change, but the price of that transformation was being paid by every cell in my body. The airlock felt a world away. My vision was starting to tunnel, the grey chaos at the edges of my visor turning black. Just a little further, I told myself. For Lena. For this boy. The thought was a mantra, a prayer. I don't know how long I stumbled through that frozen nightmare, but finally, the faint, green glow of the airlock's entry light appeared through the swirling snow. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I practically collapsed against the outer door, my frozen fingers fumbling with the keypad. I punched in the code, my body shaking uncontrollably. The door slid open, and I half-carried, half-dragged Leo into the decontamination chamber. As the outer door hissed shut, plunging us into blessed, deafening silence, I collapsed to the floor, the boy still clutched tightly to my chest. I had done it. I had broken ranks. I had stared into the teeth of the beast and stolen a life from its jaws. But as the inner door began its cycle, revealing the stark, white corridor and the two imposing figures of the military police waiting for me, I knew my battle with the storm was over. My war with the Admiral had just begun. The sterile, white light of the corridor was a physical blow after the grey chaos of the storm. It was unforgiving, revealing the frost clinging to my suit and the exhaustion etched deep into my bones. The two military police officers stood like statues, their faces grim and unreadable behind their helmet visors. They didn't rush to help with the child, they waited, their very stillness an accusation. Behind them, his face a mask of furious disbelief, was Lieutenant Rask. His eyes, small and hard, raked over me, dismissing the shivering child in my arms as an inconvenient piece of evidence. Sergeant Rostova, Rask's voice was dangerously quiet, a low snarl that cut through the hum of the station. You have violated direct orders. You have compromised this station. You are under arrest. The words felt absurd, a bureaucratic nightmare crashing into the raw reality of survival. I held Leo tighter, his small body racked with shivers against my own. This child needed help, sir, I said, my voice hoarse. He would have died. Rask took a step forward, his gaze finally flicking to the boy, his lip curling in contempt. That was not your determination to make. Your actions could have killed us all. Medics finally pushed past him, their faces a mixture of professional concern and wary fear. They gently but quickly took Leo from my arms, wrapping him in thermal blankets and rushing him towards the infirmary. I watched them go, a profound sense of loss washing over me as my arms felt suddenly, terribly empty. The moment the child was gone, the MPs moved in. They didn't handle me roughly, but with a cold, impersonal efficiency that was somehow worse. They removed my helmet and outer gear, the sudden exposure to the corridor's regulated air making my skin prickle painfully. One of them produced a pair of magnetic cuffs, and the sharp click as they locked around my wrists was the sound of my future being sealed. I wasn't a hero. I was a prisoner. The walk to the brig was a blur of hostile stares and hushed whispers. News traveled fast on Hyperion. The cog had broken. The machine was threatened. My defiance was a virus, and Rask was the antibody, intent on purging it. He led the way, his back ramrod straight, a walking embodiment of the Admiral's iron will. The brig was a small, windowless cell, furnished with nothing but a metal slab for a bed. The door slid shut with a heavy, final thud. The cat-and-mouse dynamic had begun, only I felt less like a mouse and more like an insect already pinned to a board. Hours bled into one another. No one came. No one spoke to me. The isolation was a new kind of storm, a psychological vortex of fear and uncertainty. I replayed the rescue over and over, the feeling of the wind, the sight of Leo's blue-tinged face. Had I made the right choice? The question was a torment. My sense of honor, my core belief in protecting the innocent, screamed yes. But the cold logic of my situation, the reality of the consequences, whispered no. A new face finally appeared at the small viewport in the door. It was a young medic, barely out of training, her eyes wide and sympathetic. She was the helper, the unexpected ally. She slid a tray of nutrient paste through the slot. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "His core temperature is rising. You saved him." Sergeant Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sharp. "Thank you," I managed to choke out. "What's happening? Has anyone?" "The Admiral knows," she cut me off, her gaze darting nervously down the hall. Taken a personal interest. Lieutenant Rask is building the case for a court-martial. Insubordination during a crisis, compromising the station, they're saying you could get life. Or worse." She swallowed hard. "I shouldn't be talking to you. But what you did, it was right." She scurried away, leaving me with the cold comfort of her words and the heavy weight of my new reality. The Admiral himself. The man was a legend, a myth. A veteran of the Outer Rim conflicts, a strategist who had never lost a battle. He ran the Northern Fleet with the precision of a master watchmaker. To him, I was less than nothing, a faulty component to be discarded. The thought of facing him was more terrifying than the storm. The next visitor was Rask. He entered the cell, the door hissing shut behind him, trapping me in the small space with my accuser. He held a datapad, his face alight with a kind of righteous zeal. "A formal interrogation, Rostova," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Though it's merely a formality. Your guilt is self-evident." The interrogation was brutal. He didn't ask about the boy. He asked about pressure differentials, airlock cycle times, potential structural stress from the wind shear. He twisted my act of rescue into an act of reckless endangerment. My answers were short, clipped. I refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking me. My motive was to save a child's life, Lieutenant. "It's as simple as that. Your motives are irrelevant," he shot back. "Your actions are all that matter. You gambled with 300 lives for the sake of one. In the Admiral's calculus, that is an unforgivable equation." The mention of his name again sent a chill through me. Rask was the Admiral's instrument, his sharpest blade. He saw the world in black and white, in protocol and breach. My defiance was an ugly splash of color on his pristine canvas. He finished his litany of my crimes, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He stood to leave. "You'll remain here until the formal hearing. The Admiral is overseeing the proceedings himself." He paused at the door, turning back to deliver his final, crushing blow. "He wants to see you. Personally. In his office." Now the bottom dropped out of my stomach. This was it. The confrontation I never thought would happen. The lowly sergeant, the broken rank, summoned to the inner sanctum of the god of this frozen world. Rask's smirk widened. Try to stand up straight, Sergeant. The Admiral despises weakness. The walk from the brig to the command tower was the longest of my life. The two MPs flanked me, their boots echoing with grim finality on the metal floors. We ascended in a silent gravelift, the station's levels falling away beneath us until we reached the apex, the place they called the Ice Spire. This was the Admiral's domain. His office was not an office, it was a declaration of power. One entire wall was a sheet of reinforced plasteel, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the raging blizzard. The storm was not a threat to him, it was a spectacle, a piece of violent art he could observe from his throne. The room was vast and minimalist, furnished with dark, severe lines. The only personal touch was a single, silver-framed photograph on the massive obsidian desk, turned away from my view. And behind that desk, silhouetted against the fury of the storm, stood Admiral Kalen Vance. He was exactly as the legends described. Tall, imposing, with a stillness that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. His uniform was immaculate, adorned with the medals and insignia of a long and brutal career. His hair was the color of iron filings, his face a landscape of harsh angles and controlled discipline. He didn't turn as I was marched in and halted before his desk. He simply stared out at the blizzard, as if I were nothing more than a minor disturbance, an insect buzzing at the window of his consciousness. The MPs retreated, the door closing with a soft, ominous hiss. We were alone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken threat. It was a test, a tool to unnerve me, and I refused to fail it. I stood at attention, my gaze fixed on the back of his head, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Sergeant Eva Rostova. He said my name not as a question, but as a judgment. He turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were the color of a winter sea, deep, cold, and stormy. They were the eyes of a predator, assessing its prey. You have a file, he continued, his gaze pinning me in place, that describes a soldier of exemplary discipline. Top of your class in survival training. A perfect record. Until 72 hours ago he moved from behind the desk, circling me like a shark. He moved with a quiet, dangerous grace that belied his size. You broke the single most important rule on this station. You disregarded a direct order from your commanding officer. You chose the one over the many. Explain yourself. His tone was not angry. It was far worse. It was a cold, clinical demand for data. I swallowed, my throat dry. There is nothing to explain, Admiral. I saw a child in distress. My duty was to act. Your duty, he countered, stopping directly in front of me, forcing me to meet his icy gaze, is to obey. Your duty is to the integrity of this facility and every soul within it. You are a soldier, Sergeant. You are not a savior. Your sentimentality, your reckless emotionalism, could have killed us all. It was the same argument as Rask's, but from his lips, it carried the weight of absolute authority. He was the protector of his world, and I was the chaos that had breached his walls. With all due respect, Admiral, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady, a world where we leave children to die to protect a protocol is not a world worth protecting. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to his entire philosophy. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Intrigue. You have a misplaced sense of honor, Sergeant, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that was more intimate than a shout. The air crackled with tension. This was no longer just an inquiry, it was a battle of wills. Honor without discipline is a liability. He stepped back, moving towards his desk. You are a danger. Your brand of heroism is a contagion I cannot allow to spread. But a court-martial is untidy. It creates martyrs. My blood ran cold. What was he planning? He turned the silver-framed photograph towards me. It was a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding a small boy in a red snowsuit. The boy was a younger version of Leo. A jolt went through me. Who were they? He saw the question in my eyes and his face hardened, the brief crack in his armor sealing over. Your case is now my personal responsibility, he declared, his voice once again the ironclad instrument of command. You are relieved of all duties. You will be confined to designated quarters, under my direct authority, until I determine your fate. It wasn't a prison sentence. It was something far more unnerving. He was taking possession of my problem. He was placing me in a gilded cage. You are a flaw in my system, Sergeant Rostova, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with a possessive intensity. And I intend to understand you. He dismissed me with a curt nod. As the MPs escorted me out, I realized my situation had become infinitely more complex and dangerous. I was no longer just a disobedient soldier. I was an anomaly, an object of fascination for the most powerful and ruthless man I had ever met. And I was trapped in his world, a solitary piece on his board, waiting for his next move. My new prison was a stark contrast to the brig. It was a small but comfortable officers' quarters, one level down from the ice spire. It had a bed with actual sheets, a sonic shower, and a single, sealed window that looked out onto the same swirling abyss as the Admiral's. The door had no handle on the inside. It was a gilded cage, as promised. My every need was met by silent, anonymous orderlies. Food appeared in a slot in the wall. My uniform was taken and replaced with a simple grey jumpsuit that felt more like a prisoner's garb than ever. I was isolated, but I was also being watched. I could feel it, a constant, low-level surveillance that kept my nerves on a knife's edge. The psychological cat-and-mouse game had escalated. He wasn't just confining my body, he was trying to colonize my mind. Days blurred. The storm outside raged on, a constant, muffled roar that was the soundtrack to my confinement. I spent hours staring out that window, watching the snow dance and curl, feeling a kinship with its chaotic energy. I was a storm trapped in a box. I filled the time with a rigid routine of my own, making physical exercises until my muscles burned, mental gymnastics of memorizing star charts and military history from the datapad they'd provided. It was a way to keep my mind sharp, to resist the suffocating pressure of his control. My internal monologue was a battlefield. One part of me screamed in terror at my precarious position, at the mercy of a man who could erase me with a word. The other, the resilient underdog, the part of me that had walked into the blizzard, refused to be cowed. It was this part that analyzed his every move, searching for a weakness, a chink in his armor of command. The helper, the young medic from the brig, was my only link to the outside world. Her name was Anya. She was assigned to deliver my daily vitamin supplements, a flimsy pretext for her visits. The boy, Leo, he asked for you, she whispered one day, her eyes bright. He calls you his snow angel. He's going to be fine. The news was a balm to my soul, a validation that made the cage feel a little less suffocating. And the Admiral? I asked, keeping my voice low. Anya's face clouded. His, obsessed. His personally reviewing every log from the incident. Your service record, your psychological profiles, everything. Rask is furious. He wants a court-martial, a public example. But the Admiral keeps him at bay. He was studying me like a specimen. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, empowering. I was not a problem to be solved, but a puzzle to be understood. On the third day of my confinement, he came. There was no warning, just the hiss of the door and his imposing presence filling the small room. He was out of uniform, dressed in a simple black sweater and trousers that did nothing to diminish his aura of authority. He held 2 mugs, steam curling from them. He offered one to me. It was hot chocolate. The absurdity of the gesture was staggering. It was a calculated move, designed to disarm me, to shift the power dynamic. I took the mug, my fingers brushing his. The contact was like an electric shock, a brief, startling connection in the sterile coldness of our conflict. The storm is weakening, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He stood by the window, looking out. It will break by tomorrow, and then what happens to me? I asked, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. He turned from the window, his gaze intense. That is what I am here to determine. He began to talk, not about my crime, but about the nature of leadership, of responsibility. He spoke of his first command, a frigate on the edge of a collapsing star system, of the impossible choices he'd had to make. He was testing me, baiting me, trying to draw out my philosophy to compare it to his own. His core motivation, I realized, was not cruelty. It was a profound, deeply ingrained belief that control was the only thing that kept chaos at bay. Control was protection. Control was love, in its own twisted, possessive way. "You see chaos, Sergeant, and you run towards it," he said, his eyes searching my face. "I see it, and I build a wall to contain it." "Your wall left a child to die on the wrong side of it," I countered, my voice low and fierce. The truth of my words hit him. I saw it in the subtle tightening of his jaw, the flicker of that same unreadable emotion in his eyes. He was not used to being challenged, not like this. He was intrigued, and perhaps even transformed, by my defiance. "Who was in the photograph on your desk?" I asked, the question bold, a direct probe at his hidden vulnerability. The warmth vanished from the room. His face became a mask of ice once again. "That is not your concern," he said, his voice clipped. He placed his untouched mug on the table. "You believe your actions were honorable. But honor is a luxury. Here, survival is the only virtue." He left as suddenly as he had arrived, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving me with the scent of chocolate and the chilling sense of a man at war with himself. My defiance and integrity were a mirror, and he was being forced to look at his own reflection. That night, Anya came with my vitamins, but this time her hands were trembling. She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into my palm. "I shouldn't," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "But you deserve to know. He's not who everyone thinks he is." I waited until she was gone, my heart pounding. I unfolded the paper. It was a printout of an old news file, heavily redacted. The headline read, "Tragedy at Xylo's Colony, Structural Failure Claims Dozens, Including Family of Rising Officer." The officer's name was Kalen Vance. The article detailed a catastrophic habitat collapse on a remote colony world 20 years ago. A sudden, violent ice storm, much like this one, had compromised a residential dome. The rescue efforts were hampered by a rigid, by-the-book commander who refused to risk his crews until the storm had passed. By then, it was too late. Among the dead were Vance's own wife and his 5-year-old son. The article included a small, grainy photo. It was the woman from the picture on his desk. And the boy in her arms, wearing a little red snowsuit, was the son he had lost. The mystery was revealed, and the present conflict was brutally recontextualized. This wasn't just about military discipline for him. It was a wound, 20 years old, that had never healed. My act of defiance, of saving a small boy in a red suit from a storm, wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a ghost from his past, a living embodiment of the choice he hadn't made. Leo was his son. I was the person he wished he had been. His obsession with my case, his cold fury, his strange moments of intimacy, it was all the desperate, agonized thrashing of a man confronting his own personal code of honor, a code he felt he had broken long ago. He hadn't built a wall to keep the chaos out. He had built it to keep his own grief and guilt locked inside. And I, with my simple, defiant act of humanity, had just kicked down the door. The knowledge was a heavy weight, a terrible and profound key to understanding the man who held my life in his hands. He was not just an antagonist, he was a tragic figure, a powerful man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. The next morning, the wail of a new alarm blared through the station, a sound I had never heard before. It was a high-pitched, desperate siren that spoke of imminent, catastrophic failure. The muffled roar of the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if in answer. A voice, strained with panic, crackled over the station-wide comms. "This is engineering. Geothermal conduit in Sector Delta has ruptured. We have a critical power failure. Life support is switching to emergency reserves." The rising stakes had just been thrown onto the table with explosive force. The storm, in its final death throes, had dealt us a crippling blow. Emergency reserves would only last a few hours. Without the geothermal plant, the station would freeze, and we would all die. My door hissed open. It wasn't an orderly. It was Admiral Vance, already dressed in a heavy-duty engineering suit, his face a mask of grim determination. Behind him, Rask was shouting, "Admiral, this is insane. We need every qualified engineer. We can't waste time with a prisoner." "She's not a prisoner anymore," Vance spit out, his icy gaze locking with mine. She's a resource. Her file says she has the highest aptitude scores for extreme environment repair in the entire Northern Fleet. He threw a suit identical to his onto my bed. Can you do it, Sergeant? The rupture is on the exterior, near the sea intake vents. It's the most exposed point on the station. This was it. The moment of truth. He was asking me to go back out there, into the teeth of the dying but still lethal storm. The irony was a bitter pill. The very act he had condemned me for was now the one he was asking me to perform. I can do it, I said, my voice clear and steady. But my price is a full pardon. And you will answer my question. A muscle feathered in his jaw. We were no longer Admiral and Sergeant. We were two people staring into the abyss, negotiating terms. Name it, he said. The boy in the picture, I said, my voice softening slightly. Your son. What was his name? The blow landed. I saw the raw pain in his eyes, the shock that I could possibly know. He looked away for a second, towards the window and the storm that had taken his family. When he looked back, the predator was gone, replaced by a man haunted by ghosts. His name was Liam, he whispered, the name an exhalation of 20 years of grief. Now get that suit on. We're moving out. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Rask watched, his face a thundercloud of impotent fury, as I suited up. He could not comprehend what was happening. To him, this was a breach of every protocol. To Vance, it was something else entirely, a desperate, illogical, and perhaps final attempt at redemption. We ran through the corridors, the emergency lights casting long, dancing shadows. The station was in chaos, but Vance's presence cut through it like a knife. His authority was absolute, his commands sharp and precise. He was a man in his element, fighting a war against the chaos he so despised. We reached the airlock, the same one I had used to save Leo. This time, as the outer door opened, Vance was at my side. We stepped out together into the screaming wind. The storm was weaker, but it was still a ferocious, deadly thing. He clipped his line next to mine. The conduit is 30 meters from here, he shouted over our private comlink. The repair kit has a self-sealing plasma welder. You'll only have one shot. As we fought our way across the exterior of the station, side by side against the raging wind, I realized the truth. He hadn't just brought me along for my skills. He had come with me. He was facing the ghost of the storm that had taken his family, the storm he had not ventured into before. He was breaking his own deepest, most sacred rule. We reached the ruptured conduit. It was a gaping wound in the station's side, spewing superheated steam that froze instantly into a crystalline cloud. The damage was severe. Working in tandem, we managed to clear the ice away. It was my job to apply the plasma seal, my smaller hands better suited for the delicate work. As I prepared the welder, a massive gust of wind, a final, spiteful roar from the dying storm, tore a sheet of ice from the comms array above. It sliced downwards, straight for Vance. "Admiral, look out!" I screamed, shoving him with all my strength. He stumbled back as the sheet of ice slammed into the spot where he had been standing, shattering into 1,000 razor-sharp pieces. He looked at me, his eyes wide behind his visor. I had just saved his life. I turned back to my work, my hands surprisingly steady, and applied the plasma seal. It flared with a brilliant, blue-hot light, and the hissing of the steam stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. A green light blinked on my HUD. The conduit was sealed. Power would be restored. We had done it. We stood there for a moment, two figures against the vast, violent backdrop of the Arctic, a silent understanding passing between us. He was no longer just the powerful antagonist, and I was no longer just the defiant underdog. We were two survivors, bound by the storm, by the ghosts of the past, and by the life of a small boy named Leo. As we turned to go back, he put a hand on my arm, stopping me. His voice came over the comm, quiet and raw. "Thank you, Eva." He had used my first name. The war was over. The climax of my personal battle had passed, and something new, something fragile and intense, was beginning to form in its place. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind died down to a whisper, and the sun, a pale, hesitant disk, rose over the horizon, setting the endless fields of snow and ice ablaze with a cold, brilliant light. The station was saved. The geothermal plant hummed with its familiar, life-sustaining rhythm. The crisis was over. My fate, however, was still an open question. I was taken not to my gilded cage, but to the infirmary. As I walked in, my suit still crusted with ice, a small figure launched himself from a bed and wrapped his arms around my legs. It was Leo. "My snow angel," he said, his voice muffled against my suit. I knelt and hugged him back, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked me over. Across the room, I saw Admiral Vance watching us. The mask of command was gone. In its place was an expression of profound, aching vulnerability. He was watching me with the son he had saved, and seeing the ghost of the son he had lost. The moment was a quiet, intimate confession of everything he couldn't say. The rivalry between myself and Rask was settled without a word. The lieutenant stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of disbelief and defeat. He had lost. His rigid world of rules and regulations had been shattered by an act of chaotic humanity, an act the Admiral himself had ultimately validated. My pardon was not announced over the station-wide comms. There was no ceremony, no public exoneration that would undermine the Admiral's authority. It was handled quietly, personally. He summoned me back to the ice spire, back to his office. The view from the window was no longer a swirling vortex of grey, but a breathtaking panorama of white and blue, serene and beautiful. The war was won. He stood behind his desk, the picture of his wife and son now facing forward, a silent testament to the change in him. "Sergeant Rostova," he began, his voice formal, but the coldness was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. "Your actions, both in the retrieval of the child and the repair of the conduit, have been noted. A court-martial is no longer on the table." I waited, knowing there was more. He wouldn't just let me go. That wasn't his way. Control was his nature. "However," he continued, his eyes locking with mine, "your unique approach to problem-solving and your demonstrated capabilities under extreme pressure make you a liability in the general ranks. You are too unpredictable." He came around the desk, stopping just before me, the space between us charged with unspoken tension. The romantic, dangerous energy that had simmered beneath the surface of our conflict was now palpable. "Therefore," he said, his voice dropping to that low, possessive tone I now knew so well, "I am reassigning you. Effective immediately. You will serve on my personal staff. Here." In the ice spire it was a punishment and a promotion. A sentence and a reward. He was not letting me go. He was pulling me closer, binding my fate to his. It was the ultimate act of possession, framed as a logical, military decision. He was putting his beautiful, dangerous flaw in a place where he could watch it, control it, and protect it. The final scene of our drama was set. The power dynamic, once a vast chasm between us, was now a taut wire connecting us. "You are an anomaly, Eva," he said, the use of my first name a final, deliberate intimacy. "And you are a disruption to my world." He leaned closer, his whisper a mixture of a threat and a promise that sent a shiver down my spine. "You are mine now." The ending was not a neat bow. It was not a simple victory. It was the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous. I had survived the storm. I had confronted the Admiral. And now, I belonged to him. The future stretched before me, as vast and uncertain as the Arctic landscape outside, full of tense, romantic, and hopeful peril. I had broken ranks to save a child, and in doing so, I had irrevocably chained myself to the one man I was never meant to cross.